Okay, everyone, so let's get started then. Thank you for joining today's webinar. Once again, I'm very excited to be here. And you may know me from the previous sessions, but if you don't know, if this is your first session, very nice to meet you. My name is Fernando Vizcaino. I'm an Alteryx specialist and also an Alteryx Server specialist, of course. And I've been working with Server for the past 8 years, right? So I have all the certifications. I'm working on the communities, both on the designer board and the server board on a daily basis. So maybe you saw me there, but if not, very nice to meet you once again. So if you would like to know more about Alteryx in general or any other platform actually, so please follow us on Data Mining on LinkedIn or on our YouTube channel. We are posting content there on a weekly basis. I think we are posting 3 videos weekly in our YouTube channel related to Alteryx, related to Tableau, and many other platforms. About data mining, so we are an end-to-end BI solution, and if you have a problem with data, we will be able to support you. As you can see here, we have various types of services. It goes from the understanding your use case or helping you understand what you have in your industry, from there until all the way for data viz solutions, data management, change management, and anything related to education and training. So if you're interested in know more about our platforms, feel free to access our websites. And here we have a few of our partnerships, right? And as you can see for Alteryx here, we are partner of the year, both global and Americas, 2 years in a row, right? So I think we know what we are talking about here. All right, but moving forward here, we are on our 8th session. We'll be talking about architecture and scaling up. It's a long journey. You know already how to use your gallery, how to configure your gallery, as well as how to install, right? And right now we are going to be talking about how to scale or how to identify needs for scaling your gallery. So since the beginning, we are talking about single node environments in general, but right now you're going to see the options there for you to add more workers, add more workflows to run at the same time, for problems that you have when you increase the number of users that are accessing your gallery at the same time. So we have various solutions here related to many types of issues. And later, of course, we have 4 additional sessions, 4 advanced sessions, I might say, related to MongoDB, Alteryx Server troubleshooting, as well as handling the gallery APIs. So from 21.4, we have brand new APIs, and you are able to do so much more than we were able to do before, right? So those 4 sessions, I think, in my opinion, are really advanced and very important if you want to know everything related to Alteryx Server in general. But let's get started with our topic today, right? So we are going to be talking about scaling your Alteryx Server in general. And when we think about scaling, we need to think about your database, right? Your MongoDB here, your gallery nodes, as well as your worker nodes. And later, I'm going to be showing as well benchmarks, right? So testing and examples for you to do by yourself in your gallery. So you are also able to identify needs or reason for scaling, right? And that's basically it. But if you have any questions, we have the Q&A there. Feel free to ask any questions related to this session or any previous session that you already been through, right? But let's get started here with the first topic, right? So scaling your Alteryx Server overview. So when we think about scaling in general, we have a few questions that you can ask yourselves, of course. So for the reasons you could start thinking about your workflows, right? So your workflow used to run in 5 minutes, and now it's taking more than 30 minutes for that same workflow. Or maybe the users are starting to complain about get the gallery in general. So it's taking more time to open the gallery pages or open a workflow, see the outputs, the logs, and so on and so forth, right? Or you have critical workflows that you need those workflows to run the fastest way possible. Maybe you have a group of devs or you have a data science team and you want to have a separate server for them to use, right? Because since the predictive modeling workflows takes more processing power as well as more RAM to execute those types of workflows, maybe you want to separate them in a separate environment so they can run their workflows and not mess with everything the other users are doing, right? Or maybe you are worried in general about your server downtime. So how can you minimize your server downtime or even eliminate that, right? So for reasons for scaling, you can see that you have a lot of options, right? So performance demands. So once again, you want your workflows to run faster or run more workflows at the same time, right? Or you want more users in your server. Maybe you're starting your designers, your developers are sharing your workflows with more users, and those users are running on a daily basis more and more workflows. Or you want redundancy, right? So you want to ensure backups and you want to keep your server up and running, even if your database by chance gets corrupted for any reason at all, right? But when we think about all of these questions and all of these problems, the good thing here is that you have only 3 points of scalability, right? So have ways here for you to increase your worker capacity, your gallery, as well as your database capacity. So you have these 3 main components in your server, and you can scale in or scale out all 3 of them, right? And of course, for the server in general, Alteryx has here a basic summary of everything that you can do related to your worker nodes, your gallery, and your database nodes. And as you can see here, the most important one, and at least the first one that all the companies think about scaling, is the worker node, right? So if you need to run more workflows at the same time, or you are experiencing problems or issues with the execution time, then it's better for you to think about your worker node. So number of simultaneous users means that more workflows are being run. So when you think about the worker node, you are thinking about workflows in general. When you think about gallery, you are thinking about your users. And related to database, you are thinking about your failover strategy or redundancy in general, right? So those are the most important topics for you to check or to think about before scaling your server. But before we navigate deep into each of the components or each of the scaling methods, we need to review here the components, the server components in general, right? So we always start here by talking about the worker nodes. So that's the, I wouldn't say the most important part, but for the users in general, that's the most important part. So the worker is responsible for the execution of our workflows. And as you saw in previous sessions, the worker can manage multiple workflows at the same time. And also the worker is responsible for the outputs. So for all the data sets that the users are seeing in the gallery, the worker node is responsible for that, as well as for the map tiles and insights. So map tiles is related to geospatial data, geospatial workflows, and insights, the interactive charts that you've seen in previous sessions as well, right? So that's the responsibility for the worker to manage everything related to that. When we talk about the gallery, as I mentioned before, everything related to the user interface, the gallery is the one responsible for handling that. So all the backend logic and everything that the user is requesting, all the buttons that the users are clicking, that's the gallery that is translating that into API endpoints, right? So you'll be seeing the next session, everything related to the gallery APIs, and that's how the gallery is also managing all the content and all the database requests. Everything is based on gallery APIs. The database, so as other database and other platforms has, you have the backend database here, and in the server is no different, right? So have the MongoDB, that's our backend database, is managing the workflows, the applications, you have the job queue. So everything related to all the assets inside your workflow, you have that in your database, right? That doesn't mean that this data is accessible by you. For some of this data, it is accessible, and you can use that for statistics or for you to manage your server better. But some of the data, such as workflows or files, output files in general, it is there, but it's all encrypted. So the users or anyone can't actually access that data and do anything with that, right? And last but not least, we have also the controller, right? So the controller is responsible for everything. So it's managing all of your environment, it's connecting all the components with themselves, and it's the most important part of the controller node. That's the one responsible for managing your job queue, right? So if you have two workflows running simultaneously, all the other workflows waiting on the queue, it's the controller that is managing everything. And it is also the controller that delegates the job to the workers, okay? And also, for you to understand what is actually happening when you, for example, trigger your workflow manually, and you can see here that the number of components that is interacting with each other, right? So you can see here the gallery component. So the end user accessing the workflow from the web browser there. So it's accessing the gallery URL. And then this opens, this using the gallery components, right? And when I start clicking the run button in general, that sends a message to the controller component, right? And so on and so forth. You have the worker node that is sending a message to the engine to run your workflow. It's saving the data in your database and is returning it back for the user to see the results or the log information, right? So as you can see, even a manual run is using all the components of your server, right? And the same goes for scheduled runs, right? So only for you to see what is actually happening on the background. For the schedule run, you have the database component, the worker component. So you don't have the gallery component here, but if the user wants to retrieve the output data or see the log information or the schedule information, you use the gallery for that. So as you can see, even for the most simple interaction with your server, you are using all the components that we have there. And that's why it's very important for you to think about scaling as the number of users or the number of workflow start increasing. All right. And moving forward here, take this as an example, right? So have some templates here that was created by Alteryx for you to see related to the number of users, how should be the size of your server, right? And take this as the number of concurrent users, so the number of users accessing the gallery at the same time, or the number of workflows being selected to run at a specific time, right? So for starters, of course, if you are starting or if you just purchased your Alteryx server, you start with a single node environment in general, right? And as you start to grow, the number of users, the number of workflows start to grow more and more, then it's time for you to think about scaling your worker nodes, right? So this always, in most of the companies, it's always the first option, right? So increasing the number of workflows that are being run at the same time. So once again here, workers run more workflows, run workflows faster, or for you to dedicate a worker for a team or for critical processes, for example, right? And then if you increase even more the number of workflows or increase the importance of your Alteryx in general, then maybe it's time for you to add a replica set there, for you to scale out your MongoDB, right? We'll be talking more about this option, but the whole idea here is that after the worker nodes, maybe you can start thinking about your failover strategy or to include redundancy in your database, right? Actually, last year, of course, I almost forgot it, but you also have the option to scale out your galleries. So if you have many users accessing the gallery at the same time, then it's a great option for you to add an additional gallery nodes. And this is the only exception to everything else here. By adding one more gallery nodes, you must add also a load balancer, right? So the idea here is that you start to have more analytical apps, for example, or you want to provide a more seamless user experience for everyone that are accessing your gallery, right? But all right. So let's first talk here about scaling your MongoDB. So as I mentioned before here, this is our second option, but let's start by this first, right? So the idea for MongoDB, you have many options as for all the other components, but the whole idea here is that it's always related to your performance, your redundancy, your failover, disaster recovery, and your cost, right? So by adding additional nodes here, you are thinking about or considering the cost of your downtime versus the cost of your high availability MongoDB solution. So by adding additional or redundant MongoDB database there, you won't experience any downtime whatsoever, right? So, but it's worth mentioning here, if you are just beginning your server journey, then this is only for later, right? So start thinking about your MongoDB, your database nodes, only after you scale first your worker nodes, right? So that's more important. But for MongoDB, we have three different options here. So we have the option to add more, the vertical scaling, right? So more CPU, more RAM, more storage. But on the other hand, this is way more expensive than the other options, right? And here you have the option to replicate your server. So you are duplicating your data sets between multiple database nodes, right? And you have the option here for sharding. So this, I won't talk much about it, but the whole idea is that you can separate your database between multiple nodes, right? So that's something that we call horizontal scaling or vertical scaling, right? But that's basically it. I only saw this in a couple clients so far. But when we think about replica sets in general, the idea here is that if you only have one primary node, so it could be the embed MongoDB, or you have a user managed, but only with one database in it. So if your server or if your primary node fails, the Alteryx platform becomes offline, right? So, and what is the cost of that? So if that's not a problem in your server, in your production server, so you don't need to think about this strategy. But if this is important for you to not experience any downtime at all, right? So that's when you start thinking about your replica sets. So the idea here is that you have at least 3 database nodes, right? So have the first one is called primary, and the other 2 is called secondary. You have all the data inside all 3 nodes, right? But in this case, if a node fails, right? So if the primary node there gets corrupted or anything at all, then a secondary one becomes a primary one, right? And the other primary one there, when you are able to get that in place once again, that will become your secondary, right? So you won't experience any downtime and you won't experience any loss of data. That's also very important, right? But if that is not enough, you can start thinking about sharding as well. So as you can see here, we have two different machines. Actually, these are three different nodes. And then these three different nodes inside are different sharding components, right? And the whole idea here, and you have many things related to this topic, right? So you have a whole theory behind sharding, but the whole idea with sharding is that you are able to separate your table in vertical partitions or horizontal partitions here. So the whole idea for this, right, is for you to eliminate any downtime or anything. You are reducing I/O and CPU usage in general by separating the columns here between both sharding components or horizontal partitions where you're separating the customers, but keeping, for example, the columns identical in both tables, right? So that's another option when you're thinking about scaling your MongoDB. And once again, if you have any questions related to any parts of this session or any other session, feel free to reach out to the Q&A of this one, right? But let's start talking here about the Alteryx Gallery, right? And here, as I mentioned, I will mention this again, this is related to the user experience, right? But this is also related to the type of workflows as well as the complexity of your workflows, right? So if you have simple data prep workflows that is running 30 seconds or 2 hours, doesn't really matter the time, those workflows are very straightforward, right? But as you start adding complexity, and the complexity could be related to the types of tools, so it could be adding spatial tools, predictive tools, as well as user interface tools, that's when you start thinking about the gallery in general, right? So if you want to improve responsiveness in general related to the user interface of analytical apps, workflow collaboration, or the gallery user in general for the users to click and to go faster to other pages, in summary, then that's when you start thinking about scaling your gallery. And in this option, it's actually quite simple to configure in your server, right? So here you are seeing the system settings. You saw this option in the previous session that Cesar walked you through. And the whole idea here is that you have this controller token, and this controller token is very important. You have a word of caution here. So it is strongly advised not to regenerate this, because if you do this, then you will need to update all of your nodes, meaning your worker nodes, your gallery node, as well as all the designers using the scheduler connected, right? So keep in mind that the controller token here, you could regenerate, but you need to keep in mind that it's very important to connect all the machines there in your multi-node environment, right? And with this controller token, in your secondary nodes, for example, you're installing a new gallery nodes, it's the same installer, the same system settings there. The only difference there is that you are customizing that node to be only a gallery, only a worker node, or only a controller, right? So with multi-node environments, that's a question that we always get. The same Alteryx Server installer, right? And the same system settings. It's only basically customizing this option in the first step of your installation, okay? And what is the idea here when we talk about the gallery? And as I mentioned before, you have the load balancer, right? So you will need a load balancer to control everything between your gallery nodes. And the idea there is the first one, the most important one, is for you to distribute better your incoming traffic. So if the user is accessing your gallery, then it's the load balancer responsibility to send them to the better gallery nodes, right? So that's the whole idea. And the idea for the load balance for it to optimize your resource use, maximize throughput, resource overload. So the idea there for this part is for the users to have a better user experience when checking things on the gallery, right? And that being said, when we talk about load balancer, that's not something that the Alteryx provides, the Alteryx platform, the Alteryx company provides to you, but options that I saw clients using before was the one from F5 Networks. So that's one really common. And also the one from AWS, the Elastic Load Balancer, right? So those are actually great options that you can use connected. And of course, you have also tutorials on Alteryx community showing how to configure this platforms, right? Okay, moving forward here. So the third and last component, and I think is the most important one here, is for you to scale your worker nodes, right? And when we talk about that, same idea. So how many users do you have? How many concurrent users do you have? How many workflows? What kind of workflows are being run? How long are workflows running? So those are few of the questions that you need to ask yourselves or your gallery admin for you to identify the necessity of adding another worker node or adding more cores and performance in general to your existing worker nodes, right? And then the other questions that you need to ask then are how should you handle increased loads? How should we size going forward? And what is the budget? Because here you have the option to scale linear server, right? So to add more cores in the same nodes, you have the option to scale out and create another set of workers for other teams. And also the costs here is very important. So related to the Alteryx license, it's the same for scaling or out, but the difference there would be your machine, your additional machine, right? And before I talk about that, for you to include an additional worker node is straightforward as the gallery nodes, controller token, and then for you to configure your system settings as a worker, right? Then when we talk about worker nodes, it's very important here for us to also review the relationship between engines, workflows, and workers, right? So when you have a workflow there, we have an end user running a workflow that is using one and only engine, right? It's one engine per worker per workflow. But when we talk about worker, this is your responsibility to decide how many engines you have per worker. So the best practice there is for each 2 cores, you have one engine or one workflow running simultaneously. So for a single node environment with 4 cores, you will have 2 workflows simultaneously. But of course, as you add more and more cores or more and more worker nodes, this number tends to increase. And when we talk about the worker nodes here, it's the same idea. You scale up or scale out, right? So you can increase the number of cores, meaning that you increase the number of simultaneous workflows there. But the only issue there when you're increasing the number of cores is that this machine is handling the database. This machine is also handling your gallery nodes. And as you add more and more workflows here, you are separating or using more and more processing power and RAM. and that could mess or could impact the other components there. So the idea for scaling out is that by adding an additional worker node, this server is only using its resources to run workflows. Right. So the idea here is that right now you are removing or you are using your main server to manage your database better, to manage your gallery better. And another option here is for you to even remove your worker components from your main server. You have a worker node separate to do add anything related to workflows, right? So with that, you would give more performance, more RAM for your database and gallery, meaning that maybe, just maybe, you won't need to worry about that for a long period, right? For worker nodes, you also have recommendations, but once again, treat this as guidelines. So each environment has its own behavior. But for you to measure this, it's basically related to the complex of your workflows. So are you running spatial or predictive workflows, for example, or it could be related to the cadence and scheduling of your workflows. So if you have, for example, workflows, all the jobs running at the same time, right? So maybe you don't need an additional worker node. Maybe you won't need to manage better your jobs and schedules, or maybe you need to manage better your users access, right? And of course, you always need to do a benchmarking. So testing with your own workflows, with your own processes to see what fits better for your strategy and for your company, right? But when we talk about worker nodes in general, we have a few solutions here, the most common ones and also a few specific ones, but we have something that we call workload management based on QoS, the quality of service. So as you can see here, we have 3 different worker nodes, 2 additional worker nodes based on the type of the workflow, right? So this workflow can be a low priority or high priority, or even related to workflow validation. So as you can see here, the controller is only responsible for workflow validation. And this only happens when you are publishing your workflow to the gallery. So for everything else, for all the manual runs, for all the schedule runs, it will use one of these 3 worker nodes. And the same goes for all of these environments, right? So for all of the others, we have something called worker tags or tagging, right? And here you can decide which one is best for you. So it could be related to workflow functions. So have one worker running all of your ETS processes, modeling, and data enrichment. So geospatial data, everything related to data enrichment is here in the 3rd worker, or you can separate by department, right? So have one worker node for the sales team, another one for the finance and the marketing team, or even data location. So let's say here, this could be for the users in Seattle or for the data that is located in Seattle. So your worker nodes located on Seattle, your SQL server is located on Seattle. So when you run this workflow in this worker node, this will actually experience less network issues, right? So it will be faster for your inputs to upload or to download all the data to this work node, right? Or this is the most common one, separated by execution type, right? So you can have all of your scheduled workflows running in a worker nodes. As for everything that is ad hoc and manual, is in another worker node. So this would give you better ways for you to manage everything that is scheduled, right? So you know exactly that the time that a workflow schedule will finish, because you only have the scheduled workflows in these worker nodes, right? So that's the whole idea. Of course, these are suggestions, and use this only as an idea for you to to create the best strategy that works best for you and for your server, and of course, for your company, right? And also here for you to decide how many worker nodes or even how many simultaneous workflows you can run in your worker nodes, we can use this, the benchmark testing and examples. This was also from the community, right? So you have these tutorials there, you have the workflows that were used here on the community share there. And the whole idea for this test is for you to analyze your engine, analyze how many workflows, or even using workflows that are IO or CPU intensive, right? So the idea here is that you have many different options, many different types of workflows, and this is always based on the type of workflows that you have inside your gallery. And as an example here, we are using both, right? So workflows that are using spatial or predictive processing, and another one that is using Calgary data or large data set joins, right? So large data set in general, right? So these workflows are usually very memory intensive. And for this test, we are analyzing basically two indicators: the workflow throughput, that is the number of workflows completed in a minute, and the engine throughput, the number of workflows running per engine, right? And the goal here in this test for us to maximize both. So this is only an example. I will talk about this later today, but the idea here is this last one is very important. So the lower the number here, the more workflows you have waiting on the queue to be processed. Right. Of course, both are very important, but the second one is way more important because the lower the number, the more the workflows are waiting on the queue. Right. Okay. So related to our test here, we have two workflows. Each workflow takes 45 minutes to run. So one IO intensive, another one CPU intensive. So predictive modeling, spatial modeling, and another one here with large data sets. And we are including 5 workflows of each, right? So in total here on our queue, 10 workflows running. And we are measuring here the average number of workflows run per minute. Related to our server, it's a single node environment with 4 cores, 32 gigs of RAM, 2 SSDs, and 1 spinning disk. Right, so Alteryx is installed in SSD, and for everything else is running on our spinning disk here. And for the first test, and remember actually, so for a worker node, the best practice that Alteryx recommends to us is 2 workflows per worker nodes if you're talking about a 4-core node environment. But here we are using even less than that, so half of that. So 1 workflow running in a worker. And as you can see here, the workflow throughput and the engine throughput is basically the same. And that indicates that the machine is using, this is not text. So we can include even more workflows there because maybe we have more engine to run more workflows, right? So more processing power for other workflows. And that's the second test. So let's include another engine or another workflow to run simultaneously. And as you can see here, the first one is showing that we doubled the number of workflows. Of course, we are doubling here the number of engines. So we expect for this to also double. And this is the best practice, right? And when you see here the engine, it's also for each of the engines, it's running 20% of a workflow. And remember, our workflow is taking 5 minutes to run, and per minute, it's running 20% of that. So it's in max capacity, right? But let's include even more here. So let's add 2 more engines running. So now we have 4 workflows running at the same time. And as you can see here, the number of workflows is increasing slightly, but the workers, the engines taking way more time to finish a workflow. So as you can see here, from here to here, we have way more workflows waiting on the queue, but related to the execution time, it's basically the same. We have 0.3% more here. And we also will include here even more workflows running simultaneously. And you can see here that this is the even worse, right? So you have way less workflows and way more workflows waiting on the queue to run, right? So as you can see here, this is only an example. You need to use your own workflows, right? But the idea is that using this, you'll be able to analyze the number of workflows that you can include in your worker nodes. As I mentioned before, the best practice here is for you to have this, right? But remember that this is highly dependent on the contents of your workflows. Data prep, spatial, machine learning. So it's always the best option for you to starting by benchmarking your server, right? And this, we are basically showing the single node environments, but let's include another testing here. Let's scale out our machine, right? So we are adding an additional worker node. It's a 4-core node, half of the RAM, but the same stats here. So SSD for Alteryx installation and the data bundle installed on the spinning disk, right? And here you can see, for example, we have one worker node with our engines and 2 workers with 2 engines each. This performs way better than the other one. Of course, it was expected to be doubled the amounts, right? But the idea here is that since you have less memory in this last results, in the last test, right? That's why it's not doubling, right? But as you can see, even the engines here is slightly better than using 4 engines, right? But this is a 4-core single node. This is a 4-core scale out worker node, okay? So by removing your managing the gallery component and the database components, you increase here the performance or the processing power of your workflows, right? Okay, last test here is changing your hardware to SSD. So instead of using spinning disk, let's use an SSD for everything you have on your server, right? And with this test, we are only using one single node environment. But as you can see here, by adding SSD, right? So by upgrading your hardware, now you are able to run 4 engines simultaneously, right? So as I mentioned, for this case, for these workflows that we created for this test, we are able to run 4 workflows simultaneously, even more than the Alteryx is suggesting us, but you need to test that before, right? And it's worth mentioning here, all of these comparisons are using the old engine, the E1 engine, right? But we have another test, and from 22.1, the AMP engine, the brand new engine, is now the default engine used in both Designer and also on the server. It's optional. You are able to use both of engines, right? But the whole idea that's now by default, if you don't do any kind of specific configuration, both the Designer and the server will be using the AMP engine, right? To simplify here, the old engine is single-threaded and the AMP engine is multi-threaded. It's a simple explanation, but that's easy for you to understand what is actually happening. So right now we have another test here, considering the E1 engine versus the AMP engine. So have both machines, same machines, but the difference here that one has the E1 engine and the another one has the AMP engine enabled, right? And here we are doing 3 different tests. So data prep, spatial analysis, and predict analytics workflow. So 3 different workflows being tested in both environments. And what you can see here, and I will keep mentioning this. So this is highly relatable to your workflow, the workflow that you are using. But as you can see here, take a look at the runtime seconds here. So it goes from 3 minutes to 2 seconds, right? So, and of course, in this case, both for data prep and spatial, you can see here that the number of processing threads inside your server also matters right now. But before here, and you can see this in this blue graph, this blue line, you can see that the number of threads was not important, right? So on to navigate this through for you to understand what is actually happening. So this is a benchmark test using both the E1 engine, and understand here the E2 engine is the AMP run, the AMP engine one, right? So by running 2 workflows with the same engine, you will not see any kind of performance issue. When I start messing around with E1 and E2 engines running simultaneously, you can see here this green is related to an old workflow using the E1 engine, and the same one here is related to the AMP engine. So your workflow using AMP engine is actually running way faster, whereas your other workflow running at the same time is increasing the time of execution. So this is only for you to keep in mind that depending on the configuration or depending on the workflows running simultaneously, you can experience both a decrease or an increase of execution time, right? So that's very important. That's why benchmarking is also very important when dealing with both engines, right? Okay, moving forward here. So how to identify scaling needs in your environment, right? So as I mentioned, we have the gallery components, we have the database components, as well as the workflows execution component, the worker components. And with the Alteryx usage report, and you are able to download this freely in your licensing portal, you are able to analyze your access, right? So the number of users accessing your server, as well as the time of day. So as you can see here, it's very busy, 8 p.m. at night. So if this starts to increase in all of the slots here, so maybe it's time for us to think about increasing your gallery, right? The same goes here for analyzing our content. So we have the number of studios, number of workflows, number of collections in general, and the content of each workflow as well. And when you start seeing this number increase, maybe it's time for you to add a replica set, because you have more and more workflows that are saved on your gallery, right? Or maybe it's time for you to increase the number of worker nodes as well, or even both, right? So content, job analysis as well. So from here, you are able to analyze the queue of workflows. So if you have many workflows here waiting on the queue, maybe it's time for you to add an additional worker node, or separate a group of users or a group of workflows in that worker node, right? Another option here from the admin page, and you've seen this before, you are also able to see this, something that we call schedule forecast. So from here, you can see, for example, here, the darker the blue, the more resources the server is using. So for this, from 0 to 1, this first option here, the server is handling well all the workflows. As this starts to increase, that means that you have more workflows on the queue, or you have more workflows than processing power. So from here, the best strategy is for you to think about moving this workflow, for example, one of these jobs to another time slot if possible. So this is very important when you think about server scaling. So it's better for you to understand your workflows understand what is actually happening in your server before thinking about scaling. So the options there for you to think about workflow optimization, for example, right? So for you to check the workflows that are taking a lot of time to run, and maybe do the performance profiling or things like that, or even check the schedule forecast or the user report to check if have a user there running more jobs than expected, or testing the server, testing inside your prod server instead of your sandbox server. So that are things that you need always to be aware before thinking about scaling out or scaling up your server, right? But that's basically it for today, guys. So if you're interested in learning more about managing your MongoDB or troubleshooting your Alteryx server, so if you're a server admin or if you're a developer, gallery admin, and you want to learn more about these advanced topics, we have 4 more sessions, right? And in my opinion, those are the most important sessions on this webinar series, right? So we are gathering all of our knowledge, everything that we know about troubleshooting server installations or server issues, and we are including everything in this session. So you can miss, guys. But once again, if it's a lot for you to take, a lot for you to deal, we are able to support you during the whole process. So from accessing and planning, understanding the usage of your server, as well as upgrading your server, or even the reason for scaling, we are able to support you during this journey, right? So from the server installation, server migration, upgrades, scaling your server, and doing also something that we call server health check. So this is where we are able to identify if your server has all the capabilities to execute everything that you have there, right? And once again, managed services. If you want us to manage your server, manage your users, we are able to do that, as well as train yourselves to do anything that we are mentioning here or doing our webinar sessions. Unfortunately, today, I don't think we have time for questions, right? But one thing that is worth mentioning here for previous webinars, we are doing our best to do all the editing, all the prepping here for the videos for us to send you, right? But I promise you that you will receive all the sessions in your email later, right? But if not, I suggest you to send an email here to info@datamining.com asking for the recordings, but we'll also publish everything that we are doing here on our YouTube channel, right? So once again, thank you for attending. If you want to learn more about server or any other platform, feel free to subscribe to our page on LinkedIn, as well as our YouTube channel. And if you want to book a discovery call with our sales team, feel free to use this mail here. We are more than welcome to do so. But once again, thank you for attending and have a nice day.